My guest today is Alex Sanfilippo. He owns a company dedicated to helping podcasters. I love and use many of the products that he is creating. I met Alex some time ago when I was a guest on his podcast, and since then I've continued to watch him create more and more resources to serve this target demographic, and it has been so much fun. It was great to have him on the show. What I loved about this conversation is we got to get into the mindset of an entrepreneur and how he developed that mindset even before he was an entrepreneur. So we talk about the difference between an intrapreneur and an entrepreneur. So you could think of it as entrepreneur mindset, taking that mindset to your work, even if you're working for someone else. Just a fantastic conversation. You'll just hear Alex's passion come through. He's just an incredible guy, doing some incredible things. And I think you're gonna really enjoy this one. Welcome to the Meaning Movement podcast. We know you want to build a stress-free life and business that gives you the financial freedom and lifestyle that you want. In order to do that, you have to eliminate the conflict between your work and the rest of your life. But the problem is running a business is hard and requires sacrifice and commitment, leaving you feeling depleted, exhausted, and even burned out. But we believe that every entrepreneur deserves to recapture the motivation and energy they need to run their business. And that is what this show is all about. I'm your host, Dan Cumberland. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button wherever you are listening, and let's go. Alex, welcome to the Meaning Movement podcast. I am so excited to have you here with us. Welcome to the show.
Dan, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here with you today.
It's been so fun to reconnect. I know we've known each other, kind of followed each other's work for a little while, but so excited to have you on the show. The question I like to start with is, how do you begin to talk about the work that you do?
Yeah, first off, I want to go back to something you just said. We've known each other for a few years. You were on my show. I don't remember what year it was. Was it 2019 or maybe 20?
I don't even remember.
I don't remember,
it was
but
a ways back.
If anyone's interested, they can just look up Discovering Your Voice with Dan Cumberland, and you'll find it. The podcast was called Creating a Brand at that time. But anyway, since then, I've been a fan of your work, so I'm glad to be following it. And that kind of leads right into your question here, like how do I begin to talk about what I do? I'm through and through a podcasting guy, so I am full-time podcasting. At that point when we met, I was still an industry guy. And when I say industry, I was in the aerospace industry working for big corporate. And at that point was my beginning stages of realizing that I wasn't going to want to be there forever. I wanted to actually move out of that. And so since then I've transitioned, like I said, I'm full-time in podcasting and startup entrepreneurship life. And that's how I usually begin talking about what I do, is just like making that transition, becoming really from a work standpoint and identity standpoint, really stepping into the fullness of what I believe God has for me in my life. And that's where I am today.
I love it. It's so fun. It's so fun to hear about that transition. That's often, why people push play on the shows, because they're thinking about those kinds of transitions in their life. So I'd love, I think there's going to be some really relevant stuff there for us to dig into. So let's just kind of rewind a little bit. Aerospace, tell me about like your career aspirations and like going into aerospace and like that part of your journey.
Yeah. First off, I got to give a disclaimer here, Dan, because a lot of people assume I was an astronaut, a fighter pilot, or a skydiver, or something else fun, right? And not saying my job wasn't fun, but I was none of those things.
Yes.
I worked behind a computer. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm just on that. My dad was an aerospace engineer when he was in his career, so that's where I went with it. Is like I assume that you're an engineer by trade and that you were building airplanes or hardware or software for airplanes. But continue. Tell us what
maybe
is
even more boring than that. Maybe even more boring. So again, I loved what I did. I was a commercial operations director, and I worked my way up to that. I started as a part-time warehouse guy, and it was a 15-year career. And over that time, I worked my way up to the senior executive level. And I was running a division of the company, which happened to be commercial operations. So my job was protecting companies' profit margins and making our processes more streamlined and efficient across the board. And I did that for 5 different departments. To me, a super fun job. We focused on parts manufacturing below the atmosphere. So I worked with a team of engineers like your dad, but I wasn't actually one myself. And here's the thing. This is how I knew I was going to make it in podcasting, is those people thought I was funny. So I was like, man, if dorky people think I'm funny, I can make it somewhere. I'm just kidding.
There you go.
But yeah, that was kind of that was what I was doing in aerospace. And again, I got in as a part-time guy and I really loved it. And what separated me from other people as a guy who went from part-time to full-time was my ability to be really creative in the job And now there's a term for it. People call it an intrapreneur, basically an
Yes.
entrepreneurial type person that's inside of an organization. And I was always one of those people. And that's just what helped me climb that ladder. And I wasn't necessarily overly ambitious. Like I wasn't asking for a raise or a promotion every chance I got. I was just noticed a lot because I really worked hard and I brought a lot of value to the organization.
I love that. I love the phrase, or the title, intrapreneur.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, did you kind of like hold on to that title or that identity yourself, or is that something just looking back that you're like, yeah, that really kind of described that phase of my life?
It's looking back because I don't even know. I never heard anyone say that till just a
Yeah.
few years ago, even. I don't know if it was your podcast, but I was listening to, maybe it was. Has someone talked about that before
Yeah.
on your show? Because that's probably where
It's come up, but I don't know if
Okay.
we really have focused on it. But yeah, it's a
I
great
love
word.
I love what you do. I love the meaning movement. So I just
Yeah.
figure everything. If I like the content, I figured it came from your show, but maybe that wasn't the case. But
That's great.
like going back to that time, I definitely had that identity of like, man, I'm here to be creative. I'm here to kind of flex what I'm able to do. Not
Yeah.
to show it off to people, but for myself to see how I can grow this organization. And when I started
Yeah.
with that company, it was I would consider from the like American standard perspective, it was a mid-size privately held company. When I left 15 years later, it was a publicly traded company that was a multi-billion-dollar organization.
Wow.
So like you can imagine the internal changes that happened over that period.
Huge.
Yeah, it was
Huge.
wild. So like obviously the culture, what I was able to do, all that stuff changed quite a bit over time.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I think it'd be really fun to kind of explore, intrapreneurship. I want to, and then of course your transition to entrepreneurship. But just to kind of further define that and kind of fill that word out for folks, because they might be similar to you, where they're like, I've never heard that word before, but maybe that could be a good way to think about my work. What is the advantage of, I think you've begun to define it, but let's start there. How would you define entrepreneurship? And then what's the advantage of it? And I have a couple more questions, but let's start there.
Yeah. So to me, much like an entrepreneur, which is somebody who I think is like a creative problem solver, ultimately is what that person
Mhm.
is. It has a lot of ideas, ambition, the ability to execute if you're a good entrepreneur, right? You're doing that
Yeah.
same thing, but inside of an organization. So instead of saying, how am I going to make this company or build this brand for myself? Instead, you're looking internally and saying, okay, here's the organization I'm working for. How can I make this organization look the best it possibly can using my
Yes.
skills, my creativity, my ability to lead? I find a lot of
Mm.
entrepreneurs don't need to be managed. Like, I'm not saying that
Yeah.
they shouldn't have any accountability or any managers or anything like that. But at the end of the day, they're never going to be the person who's in an office getting written up for doing something wrong from the perspective of, hey, you showed up 4 hours late, or like you didn't
Yeah.
call in sick. Like, they're the people that are going to basically act like an owner, but inside of an
Mm.
organization. And that's definitely what I carried the whole time I was there. And I mean, as humbly as I can, but I showed up with that perspective. It was an internal drive that honestly, the money, the perks of the job, they didn't really directly affect that. It was more my internal self of being that entrepreneur.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a good way to think about it. I love that you said, act like an owner, and I think that really encapsulates it really, really well. Where did that internal drive come from?
That's a great question, man. Like, I mean, for me, I happen to follow Jesus, and like, I'm not here to push that on anybody or anything like that. But for me, I believe like my faith, like I really figured out who I was at a young age through that. I say young age, like
Yeah.
late teens, early 20s. And from there, I just knew that like, man, I'm called to be the head, not the tail. Like I am called to
Mm.
really help the world in a meaningful way. And if that means I'm in an organization to help, I'm going to do that to the best of my
Yeah.
ability. And I just think it got drawn out there. In addition, my dad was an entrepreneur. My mom, she was like she was like an in-home person who'd like style and cut hair and stuff like that. So she was a bit of an entrepreneur as well. So I think I just kind of
Yeah.
had it in my DNA. At a
I
really
love
young
it.
age, though, this is kind of an interesting story. At 10, I started selling used golf balls to my
Yes.
across the street from my house. There was a golf course, and we'd go over there, and I found a golf ball one day, and I picked it up, and I didn't know much about golf. I was always playing football and run around on the golf course like we weren't supposed to. And a golfer goes by and goes, "Hey kid, what does that ball say on it?" I was like, Pro V1 Titleist. And he's like, I'll give you $3 for it. And man, I kid you not, that was the first time a light bulb went off, like for me, 10 years old. And I was like, I bet there's more of these in the water. And I bet if I find them, more
Yes.
people will buy them. And that's when I kind of
Yes.
started my like journey of like realizing, hey, I'm good at sales. Like I love this idea
So
of
good.
building a business. So like me and a whole bunch of neighborhood kids every Saturday morning, we'd go find golf balls and sell them. And it was a fun thing. But that was kind of like my first introduction to realizing like, hey, I can show up and I can add
Yes.
value in this way. I was never a good
Yes.
athlete or a good student or anything like that. Like, and I tried hard with everything I did, But the one thing I really found that I'm good at was business. So I really just leaned into that. And as I found my identity in Jesus, as I mentioned, like that really just helped me hone in on that and apply it in a way that could really benefit other people.
I love it. It's really, really great, and just the many facets of that drive and where that's come from in your life. It's really fun to hear. For folks, I mean, just to kind of circle back to this entrepreneur thing, I'd love to just hear you contrast the benefits, or maybe like an entrepreneur approach. Maybe let's start here and then we'll go to the benefits. An entrepreneur approach to a job versus a maybe traditional approach. And then I want to talk about, like, and then what's the benefit of taking an approach like that to your work versus, a traditional approach.
Yeah. First off, I'm going to recommend a book, and I'm not affiliated with this person at all, but Liz Wiseman wrote a book called Impact Players.
Yeah.
I can't remember how many steps she had in it, but basically like how to be, she calls it an impact player. Same concept we're talking about. I think she even uses the word entrepreneur in that, but she really just dives deep into like how to like step by step become somebody who's really valuable to an organization. And so, but to put in my own terms, it's really like, it's you taking ownership at the end of the day. Like, it's not just like, here's something I never said. And I you can tell an entrepreneur versus just a regular employee by this line alone. Oh, I just work here. Oh, that's not my job. Oh, I don't know about that. Or, oh no, you have to go over there for that. Right. And I get some people like the temptation to say that can be pretty easy, because then you're like, well, then I don't have to take any ownership for it. But at the end of the day, in my mind, everything rose and fell on me. Now, granted, if someone's like, hey, Alex, I need you to look at this. I need a senior aerospace engineer to look at this. Then I would say, hey, let me help you find the right person. No, I don't do that. I'm not an engineer. I don't work there. I would say, hey, let's find you the right person. Here's my 3 contacts within the organization that do a good job with that. Let me get an introduction to your department for them. Right? Like, that is taking that ownership and saying, okay, no, it's not my job. I'm here to better this organization. So it is part of who I am. And man, like, here's the thing. I always tell people that they're entrepreneurs. There's a lot of people, like you and I probably both know people like this, Dan, and some succeed, but most don't. I find people who get straight out of school, whether it's high school or college, and they go straight into entrepreneurship, they struggle often. I find the best entrepreneurs are ones that started off in some sort of traditional job where they can learn how to operate around people, like, and learn to operate around corporate. And the people that succeed the most as an entrepreneur are the ones that were being that person in a big organization as well. Like, they're still shining those colors. When I left that company, man, the simplest way I can put it, man, everybody said the same thing, including the CEO who I report directly to. He's like, you are going to do so good. He goes, with anything you do. And it's not because I was just a good employee who showed up on time. It's like, no, this guy can solve problems. He knows what he's doing. He's here to be an owner. And still this day, those people all support me, that I keep in contact with from the company. But anyway, it's a long way to answer the question, but I just think it all rises and falls on your level of independent ownership that you have within the organization.
Yeah. Oh, I love that you're circling back again to that idea of ownership. And I want to check out that book, Impact Players. I'll definitely find that and link up to it in the show notes for folks, because it sounds like, right up my alley. And just talking about ownership just remind me of some of, like, like with Jocko Willink's, Extreme Ownership. I don't know if you've read that book, but like, something that I've kind of put into place in the organizations that I lead as much as possible, that like, you're, as an employee, 100%, this is the people that I want to have work for me. The people who are 100% responsible for whatever happens in that organization. No matter, if it's their fault or if it's in a different department or if something goes wrong, like, to have someone who steps up and takes ownership of it, even if they're not the one that caused the problem, like that, those are the kind of people that, you want to build organizations around, because they could just get so much more accomplished than someone who's just, oh, that's not my problem, or, oh, I just work here, or this is just my job, or whatever it is. So we're just speaking my language in so many ways. And I don't know, for people listening, I think, just a challenge is to think about, how can you reframe your contribution to your company into a contribution of more ownership and more taking on that kind of owner mentality. I think it'd be a really interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, if I could add to that challenge real quick, Dan, I thought around there, because one thing that I found that happened, and this happened to me a lot, and at first it was really stressful, is as you become that person who takes ownership, responsibility follows ownership at the end of the day. Yeah. And like, yes, that does get you noticed, but also gets you piles of work that have nothing to do with your core function at an organization. And for me, that started happening. So like, I took on the whole entire like RMA, so like return material authorization forms, like that whole process hit my desk. All these random things started just piling up because people were like, oh, Alex, he'll do it. Like everyone else just pretends like we never showed it to them. Alex will do it. And it takes a level of, and this is where I think that you really learn to become a good entrepreneur as an entrepreneur, is when you can learn to say no and delegate properly. For me, I started getting stressed out. I started working like tons of hours. And I'll say this, at that point, I was the most valuable player in that organization. And I'm not trying to sound conceited. I just know what value I brought to the table. But I was not valuable to myself anymore. And then my performance started lacking because I had no energy left. And it's because, yes, I took ownership, but that also meant responsibility was following me. And the best thing you can do for yourself, and this goes for an entrepreneur or an entrepreneur, like anyway, like if you have your own business, is learning to delegate really well in a way that enables somebody else to be more like you as well. And when I say more like you, not to follow your personality traits, they still need to be their own individual, but to learn to take that level of ownership as well. And it took me a couple of years, but man, let me tell you what, once I got that, that's when I got promoted to the executive level, was when people were like, wow, he's taking ownership, but he's not doing any of the work, which sounds weird. It goes back to the old, I don't know if anyone saw Office Space, but Office Space, the guy gets promoted as soon as he stops working, right? Like that's what people are looking for. Like they were looking for somebody who can still have all the work getting done somehow, but not be able to sit back in their chair every now and then. And I'll tell you what, that's when I learned to become a good entrepreneur, was actually through that process of realizing I don't have to be the one to do all this. I just have to pass it to people that I can also equip and enable and trust that they are going to make it happen. And I know that's a longer answer you're probably looking for, but I want to challenge you with that. Like that's how you can really experience mastery in what we're talking about here today.
I love it. I love it. As you're talking through that, it just reminds me of that that quote, that famous line from Spider-Man, right? That with great power comes great responsibility. And what it feels like we're saying though is like it's a inverse of that. With great responsibility comes great power, right? Like the more responsibility you take on, the more people will look to you to as a leader. And I assume along with that comes promotion, comes title, and that I imagine that's how you worked your way up from working in the warehouse to having so much responsibility and title within the company. Is that true?
Yeah, 100%. And that's super well said. I love reversing that quote because that's like a quote that I love. So that's good.
There you go.
That spoke to me. Thank you.
You can take that and run with it.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. When you were at the, at this organization, like, what did you think when you thought about your career and your future? Did you think like, what is my question here? I think I just want to know, like, how did you think about your path and where you were going?
Yeah, for a long time, man, I was confused. Like I didn't know what to do early on because at first, like being a part-time receiving guy, like basically what I was doing is taking out trash and breaking down boxes for people, more or less. And it's a good, humble place to start. But like I couldn't see a future. Like I knew that it'd be great to get full-time and have some benefits, right? Like I knew that would be a good thing. And then that started happening. I was like, okay, I'm close to being able to bring in money that like I could have a family or like a house, right? Like I started getting closer to that. And so like along the way, I just kind of followed that journey. And it wasn't till probably about year 10 that I started realizing, you know what, I can really do good in this company. I can actually step into high level leadership. At that point, I was in management, but like the probably lowest tier of management, if you will. And that's when I realized that, like, you know what, I can do more here. I can serve more. And so I started doing that. And then things changed when the company went public. And we can get into that in just a minute here. But like for a little bit, I was like, you know what, I'll probably be here for 30 years. I could be here for 40 years. Like I love what I'm doing. It's a good organization. They're taking care of me. Like I'm at a really high point where I'm leading and it's a growing organization. But man, like if you don't mind, I'd love to talk about like my transition out of there, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Like, I want to make sure I don't overstep here. And we just, anyway, what happened was the company went public, which I guess ultimately might be the goal of most organizations. Like everyone dreams of that. And then one day something happened, man, that like changed my whole perspective of this thing. So again, I was thinking I'm probably like a lifer at this company because like I really enjoyed it. It was great. Never had a dull day there. I shouldn't say that. I never had like a dull quarter there. Like I really just enjoyed what I was doing for the most part. I can't say it was always beautiful, but anyway, I walk into my CEO's office because one of my departments had a really great achievement. I was controlling the company's profit margins in these departments, and we saved the company like 10%. Like, we're talking like millions of dollars, like huge. And I was amped up. Like I wanted to kick his door down and like put my feet on his desk and be like, yo, did you see what we did? And right? Obviously I didn't do that. I had a little bit more respect in my head. That's exactly what happened. I sit down, I'm like, hey, did you see those numbers? And he's like, yeah, I did. And I could feel his body language and his tone. I'm like, I'm like, you notice like we saved that money. Like we didn't lose that money. You know that, right? I'm like, I'm just making sure you understand, because he seemed like not happy about it. He's like, yeah, no, I know. He goes, yeah, the shareholders are furious. And I was like, what? I'm like, we saved a ton of money. He goes, we didn't tell anyone we were going to do that. He's like, they could have been selling these stocks at a much higher like rate if they knew we were going to grow at that level. He's like, you can't, he goes, you can't exceed the status quo anymore like that. He goes, you cannot do that. He's like, we have to have meetings about that. And man, I remember leaving that office and it was a total like paradigm shift in my mindset of what I was going to do there. I didn't leave with a bad attitude. I left knowing, okay, this is where I am today. I'm still going to remain faithful and do what I'm supposed to do. But in my head, I was like, I can't stay here now. And that was at year 13. So from 10 to 13, I had this vision of being there forever. And at year 13, I was like, it's time for me to leave. I have to leave, because now I can't be that creative person anymore. I now have to follow a really simple structure, which again, I'm not dogging that organization, because that was the goal. And still this day, they are growing at a healthy pace. They're doing really well. They did get through the pandemic. But I just knew that this was no longer the place for me, because I could not flex my creativity or be that leader I wanted to be. I was, for lack of a better term, a cog in the system, even at an executive level.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think, as a company grows, like things change and there's different expectations, different, bottom lines. And it sounds like a really, I don't know, frustrating, disempowering moment. I'm curious, like, so what did you do with that energy or lack of energy or that disappointment? And how did, and then I want to get into this, this transition from being that entrepreneur to stepping out and starting your own thing. So let's fill in some of those gaps there.
Yeah, so the first thing I did is started doing some side hustles, man. Like I was like, man, I'm going to find something that I like. And I will say this, I need like this disclaimer to be heard because it's really important to me. I was there 2 years after this mindset shift, right? This paradigm shift in my head. I was still there for 2 years. And I will say this, those last 2 years were my best 2 years, especially the last year was like by far my top performing year. My personal evaluation was the best it had ever been. All 5 of my departments were actually the top 5 performing departments in the entire organization. Like I never had all 5 do that. They were a full year ahead on all their goals, which is like unheard of. And they're like, hey, if this, they told me that like because I left in 2020, like if you weren't leaving, my CEO was like, you would be getting a massive bonus. I just want to let you know if you hang around. Anyway, backtracking. So I want to make it known that I left on really good terms because I'm a firm believer that the way you end one season is the way you begin the next. If you end on a bad foot, I believe you start the next one on a bad foot. And so I just want to make sure I left as faithfully as I could, not burning any bridges so that I could start off the right way. But what I started doing, backtracking now, Dan, is I started some side hustles, failed right out the gate multiple times. I was like, man, I'm good at, I can try some coaching stuff. I didn't know how to set that up. So it immediately fell flat. I was actually decent and I thought web design was fun. Started that, totally failed. Couldn't deal with the clients. And like a few other things, like I'm going to fast forward through all those. And I finally was like, you know what? I need help. Like I need some help. And that's when I started my podcast. And you and I met shortly after that because I was like, I need to talk to people like Dan who are much smarter than I am, who can help me along the way, figure out how to get the right mindset, how to enable the right skills. Because going from an intrapreneur to an entrepreneur is actually a bigger transition than just one letter that you might think. Because again, I'm under someone else's covering and roof. If I fail, my paycheck's probably still coming in. But when you're out on your own, if you fail, you fail. That's it, right? And entrepreneurs fail a lot. So I started a podcast to learn how to become an entrepreneur, as weird as that sounds. So it was free coaching for me, more or less, just talking to people smarter than me. So thank you. I appreciate that.
I love that. Well, like you're saying, you're talking to me, people like me, because who are smarter than you. Like you're the smart one here, dude. Like you're the one who's getting free coaching. It's amazing. I love it. Well, I think that's one of the great byproducts of podcasting, which I want to get into, but I want to circle, highlight a couple things about what you said, but I'm just putting a pin in this for later. It's just like the relationships that start out of it, right? Like that, like you and I know each other, that I consider you one of my internet friends because you had me on your show, and we exchange emails, once a quarter or so, like we'll just touch base. And like, it's so cool to see how podcasting can be such a interesting and helpful networking tool. And I just love that that was kind of some of your motivation in doing that. One of the things I just want to circle back to, because I think is really important, is you said, that you're a big believer in how you end is how you begin. And I 100% agree with that. There's a model of transitions by William Bridges. I don't know if you're familiar with his book. I think it's just called Transitions. I'll make sure to link up to it in the show note. But he talks about this idea that like anytime you're ending something, something else is emerging, and like that the two, instead of it, we think of it as a timeline. You're going along, then there's an end point and the start point, but really like there's like this overlap where like as you're still ending, something else is starting, and even after maybe you're not in that job, emotionally you're still transitioning, and your identity, like the way you think about yourself, think about your work, all of that, like it all overlaps and interplays together. So like, just to go back to that point, just makes so much sense because the way you end is, it's how you begin, because you're already beginning while you're ending, and you're still ending while you're beginning, if that makes sense. So
it's so well said, man. It's so true. I mean, like nothing just ends and there's nothing else, right? Like I guess unless you die, right? I mean, like not to be morbid, like that's the only time that like things that are happening in your life are going to stop. Other than that, you're right. As soon as a door closes, another one opens. And often more than one, right? So I love that you said that, man. I think that's really valuable for listeners to hear today.
Yeah, and well, and good on you for like ending well, right? Because it's really easy to like, it's like the equivalent of senioritis, where it's like, okay, I know I'm wrapping up here. Like, let's just put this in neutral and coast for a little while I get my side hustles off the ground or whatever. So, I just respect your hustle to fulfill your obligation, to fulfill your commitments, to keep your responsibility high and end well. So good.
Thanks,
good
man.
on you.
I saw people end incorrectly, and not just senior people, but some people that are really young, like they get a new job, they're out. Man, if you ever want to come back later or want to use that as a reference, now you can't because you burnt that bridge.
Yeah.
The coolest thing that happened, man, I'll keep this story really brief. A year and a couple months after I left, I got a call from the company that I left, and they had a really senior person leaving. And they asked me if I'd come speak at their going away party. And I was like, man, I was like, yeah, I don't work. I was like, I'd be honored. Like, I'd love to be there. And I only knew about half the faces because the company had grown so much. But I'm like, man, the fact they left on such good terms that they're inviting me back just to talk to the organization, like 100%. That was like a really cool moment for me, man. So anyway, and faithfully is what I want to just share with that.
I love it. Well, and so let's talk about that transition and talk about, how that went for you. How much did you have in the works at that point? Did you already have, income? I know we've talked about this a little bit before I hit the record button. Did you have a safety net built in? Was it just like, I don't even know what's next? Like, tell me about like, how did you think about like, now is the time to quit?
Man, first off, I'm a strategic person. So I'm not the guy to just be like, I didn't come home one day and be like, hey, guess what, honey? I left my job and we're going to figure it out. Like that just, if that happens, then someone took my body because that is just not me. So no, it was very strategic. As a matter of fact, like I talked to the company and told them, hey, I want to leave in the next 90 days. And they were, again, very kind. So I went from 40 hours to 30 to 20 to out the door, basically, over a 90-day period. And that was my transition. And that was like my last paycheck. And I knew that my wife and I were gonna have to go a while. We budgeted 2 years for the company we started, saying it'd be 2 years before we pay ourselves. So what we did is we just looked at how much do we need to save every month, like, or not spend every month, I should say, right? Like, we need to look at all that to see how can we float this far. Like, what are the sacrifices we're gonna have to make, and are they worth it? And at the end of the day, what I tell people with this is, man, that I know that sounds so scary to people, and like it was scary for me too, knowing, okay, I've been making a substantial paycheck for the last 5 to 8 years. At that point, it was like substantial to, okay, now I don't have health benefits. Now I don't have a paycheck. I have no income, like nothing, right? Like that's serious. But what I did, and I always tell people, man, like making the move to being an entrepreneur takes courage, takes a lot of courage. Like to pull that trigger was one of the toughest decisions I made. But here's what I was doing. I was sacrificing the sake of the good for the sake of the potentially great. So sacrificing the good for the sake of potential great. And I say the sake of the potential great because there was no guarantee, but it was a calculated risk. I said, hey, here's the growth of our company. At this pace, we will be making a paycheck before we run out of money, like calculated. So I knew that it was going to happen. At the end of the day, there's some faith that has to be involved, right? Like, and I'm not going to bring it back to like my actual faith, but that was what kind of kept me grounded in that time. But again, I was sacrificing what I thought was good for what could be great. And to me, that has paid off like tenfold since making that decision. But it was tough, man. And it took that courage for me to step into it.
I love it. And just that idea of sacrificing the good for the sake of the great. I wrote that down in my notes because that's like, I don't know, I kind of get, I just got goosebumps just thinking about like, it's such a hard thing to do, to say no to something that's really good in the hope, and I think it's the hope piece, like in the hope and the expectation. And it sounds like you were very, very smart about it. Like that it's not just in the hope, just wish upon a star kind of hope that something great will emerge, but like, so that you sacrifice the good so that this great thing that you can see is on the horizon, that you can actually get there. And yeah, it's just a great phrase that I want to think about in my own life. How much was in the works? How much was in motion? Well, maybe before I get there, like, let's talk first. What is Pod Pros? Like, what are all the things for listeners, so they just have an understanding what your company does and the many components to it. And then I want to know, like, how much was in place and how much has grown, how it's grown over the last couple of years.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep this brief because I think we're having a really good conversation around the idea of like the actual journey, right? So I'll keep brief what I do, but totally. I did mention starting a podcast for the free coaching, right? So I met Dan. Dan made me smart, and then I left my job, right? That's basically.
But take zero credit.
But so what happened is I actually learned to become an entrepreneur. So I'm very thankful for that. But in the process, I also found the lane that I wanted to be in, which was podcasting, which was unexpected. Yeah. I thought I was just using the podcast to learn what I wanted to learn and hopefully grow an audience along the way for whatever I did. But what I found out is like, no, I love this podcasting thing. So when I stepped out of my organization, at that point, I had this show, which was doing well, and I'm very thankful for that. But I also had started a service company. The organization is called Pod Pros, and we just build softwares for podcasters. And the thing that we built at that time was called Podmatch. And to simply put it, it automatically connects podcast guests and hosts for interviews. It works like a dating app, but instead of connecting people for dates, it connects them for podcast interviews. It's probably the simplest way I can say it. But basically, if you're like, hey, I want to be on some shows to talk about anything, like I live in Jacksonville, Florida, near the beach. If you want to talk about surfing, it's going to find you surfing podcasts that are looking for surfers to come on and talk about their experience in the water, right? Like, so it's going to automatically match you and put you together. And man, that's what put us on the map. And at the point when I left, the company was bringing revenue, and we had enough history, because at that point we had 6 months or almost 7 months of history. So I was able to see the projection of like, okay, in the next 2 years, here's what we'll make. So if I leave, I was able to do the calculation, let's put it that way. So I left as early as I could, took a lot of courage, like I said, but I didn't leave too early. And that's basically what our organization does. So Podmatch being one of the few products we have, but everything is around podcasting, because that's just the vehicle that I chose to be an entrepreneur in.
I love it. And for listeners, who've listened to many episodes of this show, I'm sure you've heard guests that have been sourced through Podmatch. So we're active on Podmatch. I'm my podcast producer is often touching base with people and coordinating conversations on Podmatch. So it's a tool that I personally use, and so I'm really grateful for it. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's awesome. I love it. It's a fantastic tool. And so that was already in the underworks. Sounds like you were kind of had you could see those projections, so it wasn't like a total leap in the dark, and so all that makes a ton of sense. What was the most challenging aspect of that transition for you?
Weirdly enough, man, I'm not anti-confrontation, but it doesn't come natural to me. So like having the tough conversations after being there for so long and having to go to my CEO when I had things planned out for 2 years, projects that we're going to work on together, projects I was working with other people, to say that I was going to leave. That conversation was so tough. I can remember going into the office, and there's multiple floors. So I'm like working my way up toward his office, and man, I can feel I don't get anxious or stressed much, but my anxiety, like I felt like anxious for the first time. Like I was sweating before I got to his office, which is weird for me. And in my head, I'm like, what if Podmatch fails? Like tomorrow, people could just be like, this tool sucks. We're not going to use it anymore. And I'm like, well, what if like me or my wife have like a medical issue, and all of our savings we've planned out for the next 2 years, that's gone because we don't have health insurance. Right? Like all these things started hitting my mind of like, what are we going to do? And like, this is in my head, like, at some point your primal instincts kick in of like, danger. This is a terrible idea. Don't do this. You're safe. You're secure right now. And man, as I was getting close to the office, I actually remember saying this out loud. I was probably praying as well, but what I said is courage means being afraid than doing what you have to do anyway. Courage means being afraid than doing what you have to do anyway. And I went in the office and I just sat down. I just was like, hey man, I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. I'm like, I'm leaving. And it was one of those things where he just looked at me. He's like, are you serious? And and he just goes, man, that's where the whole thing started of like, hey, I know the type of person you are. You're going to succeed. You're going to do well. Yeah. Just super supportive. And man, I left that day, and like, it was interesting because I was working, it was during COVID. So I was working remote. So we barely ever went to the office. Turned around and like, I'm not like a crier, man, but like I shed a few tears when I looked at that building. Like, this is the last time I'm going to I'm not going to come here to work ever again. And that whole thing, man, was crazy. And by the time I drove home 15 minutes later, because it was only 15 minutes away from my home, I felt a weight lifted off me that I didn't know existed. It was weird. It was like I was wearing like a weighted vest and I didn't know it was on. And when by the time I was home, I just felt like light and I felt free and like I was able to like dream again. Cause for the last couple of years, remember, like when I went public, I wasn't really dreaming the way I was. I was more, again, a cog in the system, but now I was free once again, man. And I'll tell you what, like that feeling was so worth the anxiety that came before it, the tough conversation that came before it. But that was like a beautiful exchange for me. This all happened in like a 2-hour period, but man, I'll never forget those days.
So good, man. What a just a meaningful, significant vignette into that transition. And I can like feel that weight lifting off your shoulders as you tell it, which is just, so good. So well told. For folks who are like thinking about making a transition like this, and maybe they're a few years out like you were, and when you were starting to kind of plot things out, but like, do you have any, I just want to invite you to just speak straight to those folks who are listening right now. If you have any words of encouragement, advice, or, anything to say to them, what would you say?
No, thanks for the stage right here, man. I really appreciate it. What I'd share obviously is like, take courage, right? I think that's really important. Sacrifice the good for the sake of potential grades we talked about. Take a calculated risk, like be smart about it. But when it comes to being an entrepreneur, I found these 4 things to be the most important. Number 1, find an area of passion. Doesn't necessarily need to be purpose, but needs to be passion, like something that you really love. Dive into the community of whatever that is. So wherever your passion is, dive in the community. And then from there, what you want to do is as you get into the community, like fully engraved, like become part of it, search for problems that people in that community have, talk to people, ask them what they're struggling with, look around, see what you can see. When you find that problem, create a solution for it. And when you create that solution, I find that you're already in the community. These people are going to embrace it. So for me, the reason that Podmatch and PodPros has worked so well is because at that point, I was already in the podcasting space. I was friends with so many people that started off on the platform. So I encourage you, like if you're thinking, man, I know I want to do something, don't keep on shooting in the dark. Stop, find that area of passion, dive into the community, find the problem that they have, and then offer a solution. And when you do these things, I find like even if you fail, you're still adding value to people that you care about in an area that you're passionate about. And there's really no way to lose when you do that. And you just keep on trying to find that next problem and solving it.
I love it. It's such a good framework. Find that area of passion. First, second, dive into the community. Third, find problems. And then 4th, create solutions. And that's really, I feel like the map of any, really good entrepreneurial endeavor, right? Like as entrepreneurs, our job is to find problems and create solutions for those problems. And so that's, just great words of encouragement. I know we're coming up on our time. I feel like I have so many more things I want to talk to you about, but you'll just have to save those for another time. Because I wanted to get more deeper into your expertise around podcasting and everything like that. But I know we're coming up on
this was great, man. I think this direction for the meaning movement, and just as a listener to this podcast, I think this was like a great direction for listenership. I know it's one that this is the type of content I seek out. Not obviously. I'll be real, man. I might skip this episode, but I'll listen to the next one after. It's me, but no. In general, man, I think this was just really valuable. And I do a little bit in podcasting, which anybody can find by doing a little bit of research. But I think what's really important is what we've just talked about and how it really is going to cause a meaningful movement in somebody's life, for lack of a better term.
Yes, I love that. Way to tie it all up in a nice bow for me there, Alex. That's so awesome. But I think that like these kinds of questions and the things that we're talking about, responsibility of making these transitions of not leaving before it's before you're ready and not burning the bridge, all of this, like this is stuff that everyone goes through and questions that everyone thinks about. And so I really just appreciate your openness and expertise and your wisdom that you've gained along the way, and you sharing that with folks. So thank you for all of this. For folks that want to follow along with you, your work, connect with you, start a podcast, anything like, what would you like to invite people to who want to find you on the internet?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Making it really simple, it's just podpros.com. Podpros.com. You can find anything I'm doing there. All the projects are listed, like super transparent. And however you reach out, you're going to reach me. I like to be really accessible. So however you decide to, you'll find me. But everything I do is at that hub at podpros.com. But man, I highly recommend hanging here. The Meaning Movement and where Dan is taking you guys, like this is an incredible platform. And I'm honored to be here. It's like a dream come true. So for the last few years, awesome. This has been something I'm just like, man, how cool to be here. It's like I've arrived. But thank you again for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
So great. Well, thank you so much for just the kind words. It's been so great to have you on the show and to reconnect here, and look forward to staying connected.
Thanks again, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for watching and listening. You can find links to everything that we talked about in our show notes at themeaningmovement.com. If you haven't left a rating or review wherever you're watching or listening, please take a moment to do that. On YouTube, you can hit that thumbs up button. On most of the podcast catchers, you can leave some sort of star rating plus a few words, and that is how people find this show. It's particularly helpful on Apple, but you can also do it on Spotify, Amazon, and a bunch of other podcast catchers. Our music is by Tom Roram. Our artwork is by Eleazar Ruiz. We'll be back with you shortly. Thanks so much. There's a big problem that's changing everything about the world as we know it. Carbon and the impact of humans on the earth. We talk about it with words like climate change and global warming. But there's just two really important things that you need to know about it. First, this is an overwhelmingly big problem. So much so that it's likely that you feel as though your choices don't matter in the face of it. Second, that overwhelming feeling that I just mentioned, it's intentional. It was put there by design. The industries that make the biggest environmental impact have a vested interest in you feeling overwhelmed and powerless. They've marketed, lobbied, and schemed to create that feeling in all of us. In short, we've been lied to. But here's the good news. There's a lot you can do to make a difference. And the other good news is that there's still time. The Carbon Almanac is a book and project about these problems and what we can do to solve them. It was created and run by volunteers on the premise that it's not too late, but none of us can fix this problem on our own. We need each other. There are many ways to get involved, but simply learning more is a great start. Here are 3 steps you can take. First, go to thecarbonalmanac.org and sign up for the Daily Difference emails. They give you a short thought and a practical action that you can take alongside thousands of others every day. Second, get the Carbon Almanac book. It's full of facts, articles, graphs, and art. It's beautiful and fun to engage with. It's all footnoted and fact-checked. And importantly, it's made by volunteers whose only agenda is to solve these systemic issues. You can find it wherever books are sold. Finally, since you're listening to a podcast, search for the Carbon Almanac wherever you're listening. You'll find the Carbon Almanac Podcast Network and a few shows featuring expert insight, discussion, inspiration, and ways to take action. There's even a show just for kids. Do what appeals to you. Just do something. There's still time to make a huge difference in the future of the planet, but we can't solve this on our own. Join us.